Space, the final frontier. This is the Observer's Notebook, the official podcast of the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. Its mission to explore the solar system, to seek out new observations and data, to boldly go where no podcast has gone before. And now the host of the Observer's Notebook, Tim Robertson.
Hello and welcome to the Observer's Notebook, the official podcast of the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. My name's Tim Robertson, the host of the Observer's Notebook and also the coordinator of the training program within the ALPO. Thanks for downloading and listening. I really appreciate it. Today's podcast is episode 200, and I have no special guest on today. It's just me, but I want to talk about the podcast, where it's at, where it's come from, and things like that. And also just appreciate all of you who are listening to this podcast right now. I really do. It would not be on the air today if it wasn't for each one of you listeners. And I really want to thank you. I want to go back to the beginning, though. Episode 1 of the podcast, it was released on February 2nd, 2017. Yes, 7 years ago. I told my wife 7 years ago that I was doing a podcast, and she said, oh, okay, whatever, you go ahead and do it. And the reason I wanted to start it for the ALPO is because we are at a point where we're looking for younger members in the organization. And I thought about it, and at that time, actually, I had a 90-minute commute each way to and from work, and I spent that time listening to podcasts. And they were very informative, the ones I selected. And one of my favorite ones was The Nerdist. Chris Hardwick, a comedian, did that one. It was a geek-type podcast, science fiction and things like that, and I really enjoyed listening to it. And his interviewing style, I really enjoyed, and I really got to credit him indirectly for teaching me how to do an interview. I had someone tell me a couple weeks ago that they are listening to the podcast now, and they listened to it before, and they really like my interviewing style. Well, thank you for that. It's real nice to get a compliment like that. It really is. But this podcast, that was Matt Will that I did, who's the treasurer secretary of the ALPO. And it honestly took us 4 times to record that podcast. I got to give Matt a lot of credit for that, because that was a huge learning curve, that very first episode. Between recording it 4 times, I went through 3 different microphones. I was trying to find the right ones. I wanted a quality sounding podcast. And it just wasn't there. So I went through different microphones. Back then, we were not using Zoom. We use Zoom now to record the podcast. We were using Skype. And Skype was very difficult to use and difficult to convert the video into an audio, and took a lot of work. So Matt really was a trooper back then. He's been on the podcast a few times since then. But that episode 1, was an effort to get it right. I don't recommend anybody go back and listen to it either. We've come quite a way since then. But the process for recording the podcast is really interesting. It's a one-person job. I do everything. I pick the guests for the podcast. I pick the topics. I record the podcast to do all the processing. And we now record it, like I said, using Zoom. So everything is done by me. And just give you an idea what it takes to put this podcast together. Once I decide on who I'm going to interview, I talk to them. We set up a date and time to do it. I make sure they understand how to use Zoom, which, thankful or not thankful to the pandemic, everybody knows how to use Zoom now, so it's really not a problem. But once I interview them on Zoom, I have to then convert that audio file to a WAV file, because that just gives us better quality. And quality is everything, is what I want. I want this to sound good. So the podcast is then put together in a program called Audacity. And that's where I have the intros and the sound effects and everything like that. So I take the interview WAV file and I import it into Audacity, where I edit the podcast. Any mistakes are made along the way, any changes I might have to make, cuts and things like that, that's all done in that program. Once it's complete in there, I export that as a WAV file, which again gives us better sounding, to Auphonic. It's an online program that balances the audio and cleans up any outside noise. And the first, I would say, 15 episodes, I did no audio balancing. And I have to give credit to two friends of mine, Dan Davidson and Bill Smith, who are actually podcasters. They do a podcast called Trek Geeks. It's a Star Trek podcast. In fact, they have their own Star Trek network now. And early on, I asked them for advice. I said, what's the one thing you want from a podcast when you're listening to it? They said the sound has to be level. I mean, early on, I was listening to podcasts where one person would talk and the other person would talk, and I'd have to turn the volume up and down on my radio. Well, the Auphonic actually eliminated that. It was one of the best things I ever did. It's not free. It's a service I pay for, but it adds to the quality of the podcast. So once I have the entire file podcast, then it's ready to upload to SoundCloud. And SoundCloud is our distributor for our podcast. It's our podcast server. And once it's uploaded there, that's where it gets routed to the podcast distributors. So this podcast is not only available on SoundCloud. When you see a link for it, you'll see it to SoundCloud. But if you have Apple Radio, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, Google Play, Stitcher, Amazon Echo, Spotify, this podcast is available there as well. And there is also where I set up the release date. I like to have a backlog of podcasts. I mean, at one point I had like 5 podcasts in the queue. And that's kind of nice. It gives me a break from recording for a while. Right now, I'm about, one podcast or 2 podcasts ahead of time from where you're listening to this right now. But that doesn't end the processing. This podcast is also now available on the ALPO YouTube channel. And I must process the file again to make it compatible with the YouTube program. And I do that in another program that I have to pay for called PodClipper. Once that's complete, then I upload it to YouTube, and I set the release date again for that. So putting together this podcast, I've got it down to a pretty good science right now, but it takes time, and it's an effort to put it together. But I love doing it. After 7 years, I still enjoy the interviews. Every time I interview somebody new, I'm always pleased with the way it comes out. I really am. On another note, a side note of doing this podcast is the people I've interviewed have been some of my favorite people in the world. And that's the nice thing. I can go out there and talk to people that, I've admired in the world of astronomy. And the negative side of that is, well, some of those people are no longer with us. And there are podcasts available on the channel for some of my most memorable guests. Number one is Mike Reynolds. Mike was the solar section coordinator for the ALPO. He was actually selected to be an astronaut along with Krista McAuliffe on the same mission for backup. Mike came on the podcast. He passed away in 2019. But he's been on the podcast a number of times. Episode 6 was one of the first ones I had on. I was very happy to have him on. 39, episode 48, 60, 67, and I finally did a member profile of him. That's episode 69. So if you'd like to learn about Mike, definitely go back and listen to episode 69. Mike is a wonderful guy. In fact, a few years back, the ALPO created a special award during our banquet, the Mike Reynolds Observers Award, which is presented to someone that does the best outreach for amateur astronomy in the previous year. So that's Mike Reynolds. Another one we lost, John Westfall. John passed away in 2018. John was the associate director. He was a director of the ALPO for a number of years. He was basically Walter Haas's right-hand guy for many, many years. I did an interview with him years back on episode 29. That's a really good one too. Next one really hurt when he passed away. Don Mackholtz. Don was a very dear friend of mine. He passed away in 2022. He's a world-renowned comet discoverer. He actually invented the Messier Marathon, for those of you that don't know. And he talks about that in some of the podcasts. He was on episode 42, 58, 89, and 158. And 158 was a repeat of a previous episode. But Don, he was a good guy. He passed away from complications of COVID. And one interesting tidbit, or touching thing that I've heard from his wife, is that every time she misses him, she'll pull up a podcast. He had his own podcast, but she'll listen to my interviews with him as well. And just to hear his voice again is really comforting for her. This is something I never thought of when I started recording this podcast. That the people I interviewed might not be around someday. And this is something that they're family to, and bring them back. The last one I want to talk about was not somebody I actually interviewed on the podcast, but it was a recording of a talk that Walter Haas, the founder of the ALPO, gave. Walter passed away in 2015, and this podcast is a supplemental interview. It doesn't have a number, but it went online April 10th of 2023, and I actually have his daughter on the interview on the podcast to talk about Walter a little bit, and then we play a talk he gave to an astronomy club about the ALPO. So those are 4 people that are no longer with us that I have talked to or had on the podcast, and just it's something I never really thought about, and it's touched me that this is something that we all have. We still can talk to these people. Now, the numbers. People are asking me, what are your downloads? That's something I always publish in the journal of the ALPO. Well, I got to tell you, that first month, in 2017, when I hit the upload button to SoundCloud, I had no idea. I might have put it out there on a Facebook page or something like that back then, that we have this podcast. And every day I'd go and see, okay, how many downloads do we have? And that's something I could always do, is see how many downloads. At the end of the first month, I said, we had 25 downloads. I was like, who is listening to me talk to Matt Will about the ALPO? And the interesting thing is, on SoundCloud, we can look at where the downloads are coming from. And there were 2 from Australia, 1 from the UK, and the rest were from the United States. And I'm like, how did someone in Australia find us? It was really, at that 1 month, gave me the feeling that the potential of this. That this is actually a worldwide possibility to promote the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. We now average 950 downloads a month. And for those of you wondering, what are our top downloads? The number 1 top download was an interview I did with which is kind of ironic now going back, but it was the president of Orion Telescopes about the acquisition of Meade instruments a few years back. Since then, Orion and Meade have closed their doors. But that one podcast was linked on the Orion page, where customers and stockholders and things can come listen to that interview where I talked about what went on behind the scenes in that acquisition of Meade instruments. Another one was I found a young man on cloudy nights. He talked about making his own telescopes, grinding the mirrors and doing everything. I was young. I believe it was in his early 20s. And his name is Zane Landers. And Telescope Making with Zane Landers is another episode that's just off the charts number of downloads. I have no rhyme or reason why some of these do well. Maybe they're posted elsewhere. The third most popular is another one that's really okay. November 19th, 2021, partial lunar eclipse. Now I look back, there's nothing special about this partial lunar eclipse, but it had tons of downloads. Like I said, I never know why these are going to be this way. Currently, we have 970 subscribers on all platforms. So I want to thank all of you subscribers, whether it be on YouTube, whether it be on SoundCloud, whether it be on Apple Podcasts, whatever method you are subscribing to this. I really appreciate it. And please, if you just found this podcast, please subscribe. You'll never miss another episode if you even hit that little bell. A lot of people want to know what are our frequent guests, our most frequent guests. And if you've listened to this to any length of time, Bob Lunsford is one of my favorite guests online. And Bob's our meteor guy. He talks about meteor showers, and there's 4 or 5 meteor showers a year, and Bob comes on every single time, and he gets me motivated to go out there and watch meteors. I mean, Bob's a great guy to talk to about meteor showers, and the nice thing about meteor showers is you don't need any instruments. I love it. You grab a lounge chair, a blanket, some hot chocolate, you lay under the stars at night, which is what it's all about, and you count meteors for a couple hours. I mean, how relaxing and fun does that sound, huh? Following Bob has been on 28 times. Following Bob in the most frequent is our comet expert for the ALPO, Carl Hergenrother. He's been on 17 times. And we all love comets. I mean, every time a comet's in the sky, it's my Facebook feed and my Twitter feed and all the feeds seem to blow up with hundreds and thousands of comet images. Well, that's Carl. And Carl's also worked as a professor and on science instruments and things like that. He was on OSIRIS-REx. So Carl's also come on the podcast to talk about that as well. I love having Carl on. He's a great guest. Third on the list is Ken Pashedley, who's the current executive director of the ALPO. He's also in charge of the Journal of the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. He's a great guest. Ken has also come on to talk with me when we have our conferences. We go back and forth about what the conference is going to be every year and who the guests are going to be and what door prizes we're going to have, and it's a lot of fun. Following Ken is Julius Benton. Julius is our Saturn and Venus coordinator for the ALPO, and like Jupiter, Saturn, and Venus, he comes on and talks about Saturn and Venus. Great guest on the podcast. Rick Hill has also been on 7 times. Rick's our solar section guy and is recently appointed as our eclipse coordinator. So he does lunar and solar eclipses for the ALPO as well. Following Rick was the late Mike Reynolds with 6 times. And after Mike is Richard Shimudi, who's our Jupiter section coordinator. I think it's going to be the next podcast you'll listen to. And he's also in charge of the minor planets section of the ALPO. So Richard's also a great guest. This podcast is nothing without supporters. Supporters, you listeners, we couldn't have anything without downloads. I wouldn't do it if we didn't have downloads. But thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. But to make this thing work and to pay for these programs I need, and software and brand new microphones and everything else that I need to have, we have Patreon. These are people that donate their own money between $1 and $35 a month to support the podcast and keep it going. No money for this podcast comes from the ALPO. No money. The podcast is always 100% supported by our Patreon supporters. And I'd like to call them out now. When I started this podcast and mentioned that I was going to use Patreon to run the podcast, to support it, the very first person to sign up was a motorcycle friend of mine, Jerry White. Jerry, he's a little bit of an amateur astronomer, he does some of it, but he was the first person to donate, to sign up for Patreon. Jerry's a great guy. Love the man. We go motorcycle riding. He would write up these awesome articles about our rides, and we actually nicknamed him Shakespeare. Next one I want to mention is Jason Inman. Jason, he has his own podcast called Greek History Lessons. Geek History Lessons. Kill me for that. Geek History Lessons, where they talk about everything sci-fi. I mean, I'm going to deep dive. But those two, Jerry and Jason, they signed up within minutes of me saying I wanted Patreon. These are friends of mine. Not amateur. They're really not amateur astronomers. They're not members of the ALPO. But they have supported me from the very beginning, from day one. And I really want to thank them. The next two people I really want to thank are Steve Siedentop and Michael Moyer. They are sponsors of the podcast. They're executive producers of the podcast. They each give $35 a month to support this podcast. And I couldn't do what I do without these two. The money that they have supported this podcast with. I mean, we are barely running in the black right now, but it's because of those two as well. But I don't want to diminish what anybody else is doing. But Steve and Michael, thank you for your continued generous support. Another patron, Stephen Bennett. I've never met Stephen, but he has been supporting for a number of years. Sean Dillis. Sean is the editor of the Journal of the ALPO. He's helped out a lot as well. Frank Shinnick, another Patreon supporter. Thank you. Damon Ellis, another Patreon supporter. Carl Hergenrother, I already mentioned Carl. He's, like I said, the past executive director of the ALPO, now the Comets guy. Julian Parks, Shane, Michael Blake, Nick Evans, Rick Hill, who's been on the podcast a number of times, Stan Sinowitz, and Bob Luntz. These individuals, they financially support this podcast. Couldn't do it. I'm retired. I'm on a fixed income, and ALPO does not give us a dime for this. I've never asked for any money. when I started this podcast, the ALPO asked me, number one, what's a podcast? And number two, how much is it going to cost us? And I told him what the podcast was. And I said, nothing. I'm going to make it self-sufficient. And that's what I've strived to do, and that's what we're able to do. And I want to thank all of you patrons for helping me out and helping out the podcast, because honestly, it'd be nothing without you. It would be nothing. You keep us going. And that brings me to the future of the podcast. I like to close this out by what I'd like to do coming up. Well, I want to take advantage of video, and take advantage of the ALPO YouTube channel. And to do that, the cost of producing a podcast would be increased by a third to offset the cost of added bandwidth and video production software. Podcasts are going video. There's no turning back. It's not just audio. I've always told guests to come on, don't worry, you don't need to take a shower before we're coming on because this is audio only. But I want to switch it that way during 2025. That's my goal. The videos we have online are like the conferences. But I want to up the production value of the podcast, and in order to do that, there's software programs I need to purchase that I need to run through run through and get them looking more professional and have a little touch where they are high quality video productions. I'd also like to do a series of how-to videos for lunar and planetary observing. And I'm always looking for volunteers to be subject matter experts. If you'd like to come on the podcast and talk about how you do video imaging of an object, let me know, and we will work out a time to record it and put it online. I want to have a series of educational videos available to our members on anything. If you want to talk about how to draw a lunar feature, let's do a podcast. Let's do an educational video on it. Please let me know. I really appreciate it. That's it for me on this podcast. Again, 200 episodes, 7 years. I honestly, when I started this, didn't think I'd get this far. But thank you. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for your donations, you Patreons. Thank you. Hey, if there's an astronomer out there that has not listened to our podcast, send it to them. Let's promote this Observer's Notebook. Let's promote the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. I thank you all. I upload new episodes of the Observer's Notebooks every few weeks. You can subscribe to us on iTunes. If you do, please rate us and review us. I really appreciate it. As I mentioned earlier, you can listen to us on Apple Radio, iHeartRadio, SoundCloud, Spreaker, Google Play, Stitcher, Amazon Echo, Spotify, and also on the ALPO YouTube channel. You support the podcast by giving up $35 a month, where you see 1 year's membership to the ALPO and producer credits on the podcast. The link for Patreon, as well as the link for the ALPO, is in the show notes. If you'd like to get a hold of me, my email address is commentman@commentman.net. Next time, please have clear and steady skies. Thanks for listening.